You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victim's advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas.
Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we are happy to be joining you from sunny, beautiful Williamsburg, Virginia.
And cloudy and cold Connecticut, where we had snow yesterday. So happy spring, everybody.
Happy spring. We are thrilled to have learned about the development in the Kristin Smart case of the arrest of Paul Flores and Ruben Flores for the presumed murder of Kristin Smart. Bill, I know you've been following this case for quite a while now, so I know you have a lot of emotions surrounding this.
Yeah, I'm so excited. It's hard to believe that the Kristin Smart case has dragged on for nearly 25 years. Mm-hmm. She went missing. It'll be 25 years in just a couple of weeks.
Yes.
And Kristin, as you may recall, was a college freshman at Cal Poly University in beautiful San Luis Obispo, California, which is a Central Coast community. When Pamela, my partner, and I were living in Los Angeles over the last 13 years for me, and much longer than that for Pamela, we used to take weekend trips. And Santa Barbara, California, which is about 2 hours north, was one of our favorite places to go for long weekends and that kind of thing. We also decided to venture a little further north, another 2 hours north, so now you're about 4 hours from LA, and we'd go to San Luis Obispo, and we just loved the community. And it's got to be at least 5 years ago or more. On one of those weekends, we had made our way down to Arroyo Grande, which is a beautiful coastal community a little south of San Luis Obispo, or SLO, as people refer to it up there. When we were walking around Arroyo Grande, we were in the village, and we were on foot, and we passed a very nice home, which was an office. It was a law office. And they had a large billboard in the front yard of the law office. And it must have been 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall. And it had a picture of Kristin Smart, a request for information and a phone number. And, have you seen this woman? That kind of thing. And it was a missing persons notice. And I was aware of the case, but I didn't know a tremendous amount about it. But I remember I went up and knocked on the door of the law office, and a very nice woman opened the door, and I told her that I was interested in finding out a little bit more about the case, and they ushered me inside, and I ended up speaking to a man named James Murphy, who was the partner in the law firm, and they were absolutely lovely. And even though I was a complete stranger, I wasn't involved in true crime podcasting at that point. You and I hadn't started Mind Over Murder, although we were working together on the Colonial Parkway murders case. And I probably referenced that work. And so I think I was trying to just, demonstrate that I wasn't just asking for no reason at all.
Sure. And
then over the course of those next couple of years, this had to be around 2016, because I remember they were digging up the hillside at Cal Poly, and the FBI had brought in evidence response teams, and they were digging up the grassy hillside with a big P for Cal Poly during that time frame. So that has to be around 2016, so about 5 years ago. So I followed the case very closely ever since and read a lot about the case. And actually had thought about writing about the case. But, of course, I was also writing about the Colonial Parkway murders, and we kind of already had our hands full.
Yeah, to say the least.
And then I am aware of the podcast that Chris Lambert's put together, Your Own Backyard, and I've been so busy I haven't had a chance to listen to it, but you've now started to do a deep dive on the podcast. What's your take on what you've heard so far?
I have loved it from minute one. It is very thoughtful, beautifully engineered, and well-written deep dive. It is a scripted podcast. It is really clear that Chris Lambert has a lot of, not ownership. Ownership doesn't seem like the right word, but he's got a lot of investment in this case. He was very interested in learning about who Kristin Smart was. The first episode is very victim-centric. You learn a lot about Kristin as a person, and you get a real sense for who she is. And I liked the fact that he talked a little bit about the process of getting invested in the case and the fact that he was a little conflicted at the beginning in getting it involved because he felt like, well, other than living here, I don't really have an interest in the case. Like, I'm not involved with it. How are these families going to feel how is her family going to feel if I get involved, a complete stranger? He talked about sort of the same thing that I went through when I started talking with you, Bill, and the other Colonial Parkway murders families. How are these people going to feel about me, a perfect stranger, getting involved in their case? Are they going to think it's weird? Are they going to think I'm out to turn a profit? So I liked that he got into that, and he's very clearly well-liked by the family, and he has spent a lot of time getting to know just about everybody that he can who was involved with Kristin Smart and also with Paul Flores. So he spent really a ton of time doing a deep dive into this case. I'm really enjoying it so far. I'm only on the 3rd episode of 8. It is really fantastic. And I really can't recommend it enough. So for any of our listeners who want to become familiar with the Kristin Smart case, start with your own backyard. And we were really thrilled. The other day, I'd finished up with class. And you remember, I called you very, very excited right at the end of the school day and said, there's a break in the Kristin Smart case. Oh, my God. And I was really just thrilled to see that there had been actual mention in the press that they owed a lot to Chris Lambert and his podcast, because I remember thinking, this is what we're here for. This is great.
Yeah.
You know, we want to make a difference with our podcast. And here is this guy who has really found a way to bring new evidence and new information to this case. How awesome for him.
Yeah.
So we don't know that Chris Lambert listens to our podcast, but if you do, Chris, we are very excited for you. Congratulations. This is so amazing.
It's funny, too. One of the things I noticed about Chris's podcast is he releases episodes only every few months. So in other words, we're dedicated to a weekly true crime podcast. And sometimes we've been doing bonus episodes and actually ended up recording and releasing more than one episode in a week, which we've done a few times now. In Chris's example, because he's decided to take a scripted, kind of very journalistic, and as you said, produced approach to his storytelling, which is very well done, it's interesting to see that he only releases an episode every now and then when he has something new to say. And people were asking, his listeners were asking, are you going to be doing another episode? Because obviously there's a great interest in what they're doing with Your Own Backyard. Anyway, highly recommended, and something that we urge you to check out if you want to learn more about the case.
In our last episode, we referenced the case of Saginaw John Doe that our friends at Othram are trying to get funded. And we do encourage you to go to DNAsolved.com and take a look at the information about the Saginaw John Doe case. And we do encourage you to help if you can. They are seeking $5,000 in crowdfunding support to do the DNA testing for this case so that Saginaw John Doe can eventually be identified. So if you would like to contribute to that case, we do urge you to do so. We've contributed some money recently. We are very, very pleased to be able to help out Othram in any way that we can. So we do urge you to help out if you think that you can. We appreciate it, and we know that Othram does as well. And we are looking forward to this week's interview with David Mittelman, CEO of Othram. Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Wow, you're like a returning guest, which means you must be extremely important and or interesting.
I'll take either.
Okay. Friend of the show and a sponsor of this podcast, and thank you for that. As always, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
No problem.
You guys have had some major solves here, and you're breaking cases left, right, and center. So we are very, very pleased to be able to talk with you today about some of the cases that you guys have broken over the last couple of months. My first question regards how cases like Mostly Harmless and Greystow actually come to your attention. Do you seek out cases and offer assistance, or are they brought to you?
It's a good question. Most of the casework that comes to Othram comes from law enforcement directly. A lot of those cases are going to be like cases involving suspects. They're recent cases. We always talk on social media about cold cases, but obviously the technology applies to cold as well as contemporary cases. So that's the bulk of our work, is it comes directly to law enforcement. It's generally a contemporary case. We do some cold cases as well, but it flows directly through the agency. There are other cases, though. Some of these cases have been cold for decades, and they reach kind of like a cult status. Enough people have followed them. And I don't know exactly how they become as famous as they do. The Mostly Harmless case is an interesting case because it was only a few years old, and yet it had this gigantic following on the internet. Usually the older cases amass large followings. And so there will be instances from time to time where folks from the online community will reach out to us and say, look, this is an amazing case that has a lot of interest. We'd love to see it solved. And that's actually what happened with Mostly Harmless. So here's a guy that died only in 2018, but he was not identifiable. He'd gone off the grid. He was using cash, had no ID, no cell phone, no technology at all. And the agency, Collier County, they're just really great. They're really proactive and really great about getting the word out. And so I think by featuring him on podcasts, by sending out so many flyers, even though the case wasn't that old, they had built up so much interest in the case. I ended up hearing about it in the summer of 2020. It was like almost a 2-year anniversary. And so in that case, folks online had reached out to us and said, look, we've got this big Facebook group. We've been combing the internet for clues. We're trying to do anything we can to help Collier County get a lead. And it seems like the kind of DNA testing you do could be valuable. And obviously we were interested. And so we reached out to Collier County and said, look, we've seen this case. You've publicized it. We've seen it publicized on the internet. If it's a case that you think you'd like to solve with our technology, we'd love to get involved. And they were immediately interested. They were interested. They wanted to move forward. Figuring out how to prioritize and fund that case is kind of complicated. It did not appear that he was a victim of a crime. It's still really unclear how he died. But anyways, long story short, introduced by the public, we then got into the case details, figured out if we could help. Looks like we could help. And we ended up, there were so many folks that wanted to help out. We ended up crowdfunding the case. So the agency really had nothing to do other than to give us the evidence and let us get to work. And so Mostly Harmless is actually one of the first cases that we funded that way, funded in like a little over a week. And then we got to work. And Greystow's another case. It's a sad case. It's actually a really interesting case we could talk about in a little bit too, if you want. But It's a sad case in that there was really no leads. It's a terrible crime. It's a sex assault homicide. So this is like very different than Mostly Harmless. This is like she was tied up, with military cord and, assaulted, murdered. It was a terrible crime, but never identified. And she was nicknamed Greystow because the detective that was working the case was told that she would only be identified through the grace of God. I mean, there was like no leads. This case had gone cold. And I mean, I talked to, at the time it was Sheriff Hall, as did Michael, my case manager. This guy had been working on this case for over a decade. And before him, lots of other folks. There's so many people involved. I couldn't name them all, but our point of contact was Sheriff Hall. He had talked about how they had gone through tons of leads and, they had exhausted all possibilities. I mean, this case had really gone cold, and not because of the lack of effort on the part of law enforcement. So this is another case. It was in McDonald County, Missouri. It's a small county. This was the only unidentified person case they had. They didn't have a process for working these cases. They didn't have funding. And so like the Mostly Harmless case, because there was enough interest, we raised funding, crowdfunding to fund it. The Mostly Harmless case was funded entirely by the crowd. This case, Grace Doe, was actually funded in two ways. We did some crowdfunding, but then we've done work with Southeast Missouri University Anthropology Department. And so, there are wonderful folks there. We collaborated with them on a previous case. They did the anthropology. We did the DNA testing, and we worked together to identify a guy that had died in Missouri in 1979, had never been reconnected to family. So we'd already worked with them. This is another case in Missouri. They took interest. And so we had crowdfunding to help the Grace Doe case. And then we also worked with the university who provided the anthropological services and then also helped fund the rest of the case, a substantial portion of it. And then we got to work. So yeah, both of those cases were funded by the crowd. And through sponsorship of the university as it happened for Grace Doe. And I'm glad it worked out because in both cases, there was a positive outcome.
I also think it's amazing that Southeastern Missouri University, if I'm saying that right, I love the fact that the students had an opportunity to work with their professors and provide the anthropology to help answer the questions from that side of the scientific equation. Because I thought, man, talk about something that's such a practical application of what they're learning and has this amazing outcome that now Shauna has been identified. They've given a missing person and an unknown crime victim a name and advanced a case. And, talk about just really nuts and bolts, practical applications of here's what you're learning this semester.
Yeah, I think it's incredible. We work with multiple universities. We like working with SEMO. They do amazing work and they are invested in the future of the students. And so the University Foundation there funded the case, but then in return, we not only worked the identity of Grace Doe, but also there was a lot of educational tools and resources that were built to help educate the next generation of forensic scientists to go out into the world. And, as long as we're talking about universities, we have another relationship with MD Anderson here in Houston. And you may know them as one of the largest cancer hospitals in the world, but they have a strong commitment to education and training for molecular scientists. And we're in our second year now doing a pretty incredible pilot program in which we bring students that are training in molecular technique, genetic testing and such, generally for the medical or research audience, but they have a forensic track. And so they've come to Othram to learn about how to do the kind of DNA testing and DNA preparation that you would need to work in a forensic setting. And some have even dabbled in trying to figure out how to sort out identities from searching records and constructing family trees. So again, this is technology that's very hot and new now, but to really scale it and make a difference in the world, you'll need to train a whole new generation of students that go on to become the forensic professionals of tomorrow. And so we're doing that with MD Anderson. We're doing that with SEMO. We've got projects elsewhere brewing. But I love the idea of teaming up with universities to drive education as well. So there's a knowledge transfer, a rapid knowledge transfer. You don't have to wait, 10 more years to write a textbook and hopefully nothing against textbooks, but I just like this faster iteration. I like this faster iteration where you can kind of get knowledge real time as it's accumulated, reduced to educational tools and instructional lessons, and get people exposed now. I mean, no need to wait 2 more generations. Get them excited now about trying to make a difference. There's hundreds of thousands of cold cases, and there's far less than that many people ready to jump in and help solve them. So we'll take all the help we can get.
So in addition to universities and other law enforcement entities, who else have you partnered with, or who else are you willing to partner with, I should say?
So we've had a very successful partnership with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And you probably noticed we've had this continual, output of cases. NCMEC has 700 cases of unidentified children they're trying to sort through. And so we're working with them to clear through those cases. Those are usually team projects. We'll generally provide the DNA testing part. Sometimes we do the genealogical part. Sometimes NCMEC has another partner do it. But I love being involved in these kind of big team projects that allows us to get through cases, more efficiently. And again, it's just very excited for positive outcomes. The Pecos Jane Doe case that you may have read about on DNAsolves.com, that's the oldest case that NCMEC's ever announced solved. So there's a case from 1966 involving a girl that had drowned in a hotel pool under suspicious circumstances. So 55 years later, we got a name. Believe it or not, she still had relatives siblings that are in their 70s and 80s waiting for her. It's an amazing story. And it also kind of sets the stage for why we have to keep pushing to get these cases worked, because even for a case as old as Pecos Jane Doe, there are still folks alive who will not be alive forever waiting for answers. So we've done a lot of work with NCMEC. I will tell you that in addition, we had a recent sponsorship from AudioChuck. AudioChuck runs a huge network, as you guys probably know, of podcasts. I think the one that's probably most well known is Crime Junkie. So they actually came in and contacted us and were like, "Hey, we'd like to see some more of these cases kind of make it to the finish line. Can we help fund some cases?" So it started out as a grassroots movement to crowdfund cases, but in truth, we've had AudioChuck help fund some of the cases. Paul Holes is a good friend of mine, and through the Murder Squad, they've worked on a few cases with us. You'll probably remember we did the Carla Walker case with him. That was a case that he cared about. He featured on his show DNA of Murder, and since then we've got other cases in the works as well, and they've generously helped fund some of those. So some private donors that have also jumped in to help fund cases that they particularly find interesting or from a geography that is meaningful to them. Maybe they grew up in a certain area. So that universities, there's lots of ways for people to get involved, and we're continuously growing our footprint through public support, and then also by working with more and more agencies across the U.S.
One of the things that we were struck by, Kristin and I, is that different DNA labs are handling different aspects of investigations and forensic exploration in a real cooperative way. How does that work?
There's a lot of work to be done. So, one thing that Othram is really good at, and, I think I've told you before, like we're the only laboratory that does this work in-house in the entire United States. And when I say that in-house, I mean, like, you can send us a piece of skeletal evidence, like was done for Pecos Jane Doe or Mostly Harmless or Grace Doe. And we'll take that from evidence all the way to answers, leads and other such things for law enforcement. Sometimes, like with NCMEC, we get contracted to do one part of it. They just want us to build a profile. For Pecos Jane Doe, we built a profile, and then we passed it to others to do the records research and the genealogy. I'm happy to work in any capacity with folks, and we actually work with a lot of other groups that will do genealogy either directly or on behalf of law enforcement. What's important is to make sure that you're using the right tools for the right step. And so when you're working with older remains, small quantities of DNA, really challenging forensic materials, they need to get processed at Othram. Like we're able to take highly contaminated and degraded bones, and we just had a very, very solid success rate in being able to take them from tough to use evidence that has probably failed other places, sometimes multiple times, to working profile. And that's why NCMEC now sends us, a lot of their older cases, is that we just had tremendous success in recovering cases that have failed elsewhere. When I first started working with them, I told them, I said, I want the cases that you've already sent for SNP testing or microarray testing. I want all those cases. I want the ones that failed, so that I can see if my technology will do better. And we've recovered every case they've sent us to date. And so we will not recover 100% of cases. I mean, no one can do 100% of everything. But it just goes to show that, like, teamwork is good, but you also have to make sure that you're using the right tools. And not everyone can do everything. So we focus on our strength. Our strength is building profiles from really tough to work DNA, small quantities, highly degraded materials. Degradation almost has no impact for us. We helped another lab build a profile from a woman that died in 1881. So 140-year-old case. And we built a beautiful profile that they were able to use to do records research and produce an identity. So whether it's 140 years ago, whether it's 50 years ago, like with Pecos Jane Doe, yeah, I mean, and you can't just send that kind of stuff anywhere. If you didn't need forensic laboratories and specialized processes to work this evidence, then you wouldn't need crime labs. None of us would have jobs. You just send it anywhere. Send it to your favorite research lab down the street.
As someone who lives in an area where we are constantly doing archaeology and a lot of historic research, the idea that you could get a DNA profile from some very, very old remains is fascinating to me. And I'm sure the archaeologists in CW would kind of perk up their ears and go, "Oh, really? That's really cool. That is so interesting."
It's amazing what you can do with the kind of technology that's available now. I mean, you can unlock evidence that was just previously unusable, inaccessible. And that's really where we focus at Othram. We'll do whatever you want us to do as long as we get the instruction from law enforcement. But our interest is in taking evidence Like for, evidence that has either failed or just has never been used because it wasn't considered suitable, and take this DNA evidence and build wonderful DNA profiles from it to enable, something to be learned from it, whether it's, identifying the person, finding a nearest relative, even performing a biogeographical analysis, just something that would provide more leads that could help drive a case forward.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after these messages. One of the most frequent questions we're asked here at Mind Over Murder is, how can I help?
Thanks to Othram, a leading forensic DNA testing lab for law enforcement, you can get involved and help solve real cases.
If you have tested at a consumer genetics company, you can contribute your data to DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential. Just 2 simple steps. Your DNA might be the missing piece that helps solve the identity of an unknown person.
Then Mind Over Murder will highlight cases Othram is working on to seek your crowdfunding support for DNA testing to help solve these cold cases.
Upload your DNA profile to DNAsolves.com. It's easy, free, and confidential.
Then join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNAsolves.com.
Welcome back to Mind Over Murder.
You've also done some partnerships, not just here in the U.S., but also across the border. I know that you've worked with police in Canada on the Kristin Jessup case in Toronto. So how did that come about? And are you planning to work internationally for other cases?
Yeah, so we actually have a kind of an ongoing relationship with the Toronto Police Service. We've actually worked other cases in Canada. We have a case in Canada that we actually helped law enforcement solve prior to the Kristin Jessup case. Just hasn't been announced yet, because the thing is, when you identify people, very often it then triggers a secondary investigation into how they end up unidentified. And so we actually have a really interesting case that I'm just really excited to share. We solved it. Well, we didn't solve it. Law enforcement solved it, but using our help before the Kristin Jessup case. And I think it's due for an announcement probably in May. So maybe by the time this airs, it's very close to an announcement. And I'll of course update you guys. But we work with many agencies in Canada. Canada has some different rules and policies that have made us very effective there. Like, they're not really big fans of outsourcing, right? They like to work with groups that perform all work in-house. There's a lot of security and other kind of privacy considerations that we had to work through. And so it makes it very easy to work there. But for us, so yeah, we started working with the Toronto Police Service, and there's a wonderful detective there. It's Detective Steve Smith. And so we have this case, Kristin Jessup, that we produced a profile, and there was very little DNA evidence left. In fact, even in the original reports, when they were using the DNA to exclude the person they thought was originally responsible back in the 90s, they had remarked that the DNA was finite and certainly degraded. And 30 years later, we were able to take that DNA evidence, what remained of it, which was very little, and piece together a profile. And that's a good example of what I talk about when I say, like, you can't just send that anywhere. That'll get consumed and destroyed. Something everyone should understand is that when you do DNA testing, you're destroying DNA, right? You consume evidence as you test it. And so if you don't get a positive outcome, then that DNA doesn't come back. You can't refund the DNA. It's more than just wasting money. You're consuming evidence that is irreplaceable. So anyways, we had a very good outcome with Steve Smith. For those of you guys that are from Canada, or if anyone knows anyone in Canada, they have an investigative series called The Fifth Estate. And they just recently profiled another case that we're working on, and it's been made public, so I can tell you about it. It was a Tyson Gilmore 2 murders. They had discovered early on that these 2 women were killed by the same person, although the cases I do not believe are connected. And so this was maybe less than a month ago, a few weeks ago. There was a special that aired on the Fifth Estate, and so that's another case that we've been involved in. And we built the profile. But the Toronto Police Service is doing the genealogy and research. They're an amazing agency to work with, and they've built a really great team of folks that are doing the research, and they've narrowed it down. And I expect that they'll have something exciting to share soon. So that's another example of us working in a kind of a collaborative way. With Toronto Police Service, we just build the profiles, and then we let them take on the research. There are other agencies in Canada that we work with where we do it end to end. So not every agency in Canada is queued up yet, just like in the United States on genealogy. And so the other agencies, we do the work. But we have tons of cases in Canada right now, several ready to announce. I'm sure they'll be announced, if not when this podcast airs shortly after. Now, beyond Canada and the United States, we'll see how it goes. I think the UK has taken a very conservative position on using this technology. And so we're excited to help anywhere we can, but we would obviously do it within the parameters and policies of these other countries. And so I think the UK would be a great place to apply this technology, but who's to say when they'll be ready and comfortable to do that?
David, how often do law enforcement agencies or other groups send you physical evidence versus a DNA profile that might have been created at an earlier date? Do you have a preference in terms of how you want to approach things? Would you rather have the original physical evidence, if possible, to do the full genome sequencing?
For unidentified remains, we definitely prefer skeletal evidence because a lot of the times, so when traditional lab techniques are used to develop a DNA extract from bone, right? Like generally the goal is like it is, for example, at UNT and at NAMUS, is like, let's get some DNA and then build a CODIS profile, an STR profile. And that STR profile is achieved through a process called PCR. And it basically Xerox copies or amplifies just the human part of some specific loci. There's like 20 spots in your DNA. And so you pull out those human spots, 20 of them, and you've got yourself a CODIS profile. In the work that we do, we're using sequencing as the underlying technology. And so there's a lot of, it's very sensitive and it picks up everything. And so you definitely want to have like a cleaner sample going in. You don't want a bunch of non-human stuff, bacteria and other things that can throw it off. And by the way, the same is true even if you decide to use one of those SNP tests, which don't work at all for bones really. The bacteria and non-human load, any kind of garbage that's in that sample will throw the testing off. So there's a little bit higher standards when you want to use advanced genetic techniques of most kinds. And so for that reason, we do prefer to get the original skeletal evidence. And we've got some proprietary ways to tease out human from non-human and prepare something that's going to be a little bit easier and certainly more cost effective for us to process in our laboratory tests. There's other cases where it doesn't matter. I mean, if someone has processed a sex assault kit and they want to send us an extract, that's fine, provided that the differential extraction was good and there's a decent amount of unknown DNA in the sample, then we're good to go there. So we generally don't push unless it's skeletal remains, we generally don't push law enforcement either way. We're happy to go back to the original evidence, and then we're also happy to work from an extract. If an extract is inadequate or if a piece of evidence isn't suitable, then we always come back and say, look, can we try something else? We've had scenarios where we had to shuffle through a couple of different pieces of evidence before we find one that really has DNA that's worthy of taking to the next step. We're very conservative. We don't want to waste people's time. And so we don't see good positive indications at the early QC steps, we stop. And we don't consume any further, and we certainly don't burn any more money. And so it's sometimes a very iterative process where we look at a combination of extracts, evidence, assess several items, and then decide what's the best item that we want to put forth to laboratory testing before we go spend a bunch of money.
You had mentioned earlier in the Christine Jessup case that there was an element of wrongful conviction and then exoneration through DNA evidence that y'all tested. Can you talk about the role that DNA evidence can play in exonerating wrongfully accused suspects?
Yeah, there's two stories I could tell you. So one scenario is the Christine Jessup case. So, this was a 9-year-old girl that was sexually assaulted and murdered. And she was found, shortly after she disappeared. And early on, it seems like they had fingered a neighbor. They thought he was responsible. And he spent, 10 years fighting, in the legal system for his innocence. And what ended up happening is in the 90s, when STR testing and this whole CODIS setup, this kind of testing became prominent, that STR testing actually proved that he was excluded as a possible candidate for that DNA. And that's how they knew he wasn't the right guy. He was exonerated. But as he would later note, he made a statement through a lawyer when we had announced with Toronto Police Service that the case was finally solved, is that, the true exoneration comes when you find out who actually committed the crime. Mm-hmm. And so I think he had felt like a weight kind of lifted when they had in fact identified the true person that was responsible. There was another case, the Carla Walker case, where at some point on and off in the investigation, I don't think her boyfriend was ever formally accused, but certainly, people looked in that direction. And what a weird story. You're making out with your girlfriend in the car in the middle of the night, and there's no one else around. And all of a sudden she gets stolen by a random person that pulls the door open, grabs her, and you get left behind. Okay. And she ends up dead several days later. Like it's a pretty far out story. It ended up being exactly true. It's what happened. It was just a terrible person that by chance was in the area and stole Carla. And so, but the thing is, like, the peace of mind of knowing that the right person's identified. And, likewise, when we had spoken to her boyfriend later, he kind of relayed that, like, he kind of felt a weight lifted, right? And that they had identified the right person. So the magic of this technology is that it brings value to a lot of people. I mean, people fixate on the fact that you've identified a suspect in a crime. But in reality, what you've done is you've exonerated anyone that's been accused or convicted. You've taken the pressure off anyone that's been considered. For any person that's convicted, there's probably tons of other people in other cases that are persons of interest. They don't really know. They're not going to say anything, but they have a hunch, right? These people live with this kind of like cloud over them, and it's terrible. So many people exonerated and relieved of suspicion or clouts of doubt when the right person's identified. And then, of course, justice for the family, the friends, and honestly, the ability for not just the family and friends to heal, but, the investigators. I mean, we announced in Jackson County Sheriff's Office with them, we announced, the identity of Delta Dawn. She was nicknamed the Mississippi Delta Dawn, the little baby that was found in the river. That's a traumatic thing, not just for the family, but that's a traumatic thing for investigators. There was a guy that I was standing with at the press conference. He was himself, a young kid, volunteering for $0 to go help out on this recovery mission to recover the body. And I mean, seeing that was traumatizing. And 38 years later, when we identified her, he didn't want to speak. He was still crying. I mean, it's a traumatic thing. So it's sometimes easy to overlook the amazing impact that DNA can have, because DNA just simply reveals information that allows you to assess the truth. And sometimes you find that someone should be in jail, and sometimes they should not be in jail, and they were wrongfully accused or imprisoned. But there's an amazing wave of benefit that then hits the family, the friends, investigators, people that have been affected in any way, even tangibly, by this crime. And then all the folks that had, like I said, been under suspicion and hopefully not, but sometimes in some instances, even wrongfully accused of something. And so, excluding people is great. Figuring out who committed a crime seems to me like the ultimate exoneration.
Absolutely.
David, I wanted to steer back to something. It's our understanding that DNA testing as conducted now, state-of-the-art work that's being done by Othram, actually also consumes less DNA than testing that was done in the past?
Yeah, that's a byproduct. So we had to tune the work that we did. And I always stress, we're the only ones that do this in-house. Well, I stress that because it's not just that we do it in-house. We fine-tuned every step from pulling DNA from evidence all the way to the final testing. And we've tuned it to work with, very small quantities of DNA. Sometimes we're left with, a few hundred picograms of DNA, which is, could be as much as 100 times less than what other methods would require for analysis. In doing that, though, it turns out, I always remind law enforcement, not only can we work cases with 100 picograms, but we can work cases with an anagram or 2 or 3. We can work cases with a lot of DNA too. Because we've tuned our methods, we consume very little DNA. And so my philosophy is that there's never a good reason to consume DNA, whether you have very little and don't want to use it up and get nothing, or whether you just have a lot, but you just don't want to burn through it all, because you never know when you would need that evidence again. I mean, maybe one day you go to court and the defense wants to do additional testing, and keeping the evidence is a priority. It's finite. It's infinitely valuable. And so it just seems like if there are methods that can consume small quantities of DNA, it just feels irresponsible to ever consume tons of DNA. So yeah, whether we have a lot of DNA or little DNA, we focus on always consuming the minimum amount possible, touching the least amount of evidence possible, and choosing and kind of plotting the most cost-effective way to build a profile. Our goal is to digitize evidence for all cases everywhere on Earth, and to do that with a minimal impact of consumption on the evidence or the budgets that these offices have. And so there's a good point for you to bring up is that, there's just never a good reason to burn through evidence. You just don't know what will happen in the future. And anyways, I always tell people you can test with Othram and then live to test again. And that's important. Whether you get a positive outcome or not, even with a positive outcome, there's no reason to get rid of evidence that you may need later down the road.
So one of the more recent cases that you guys worked is the case of the publicker girl, who has now been identified as Lisa Todd. In this case, as in so many others, the hunt for her killer now has to begin now that she has an identity. Does your team stay involved at that point? Are you going to be kept in the loop by the investigative team in Bensalem, or are you done at this point? How does that work?
So in that particular case, so that case is an interesting case. That's the case that Bodhi Technology had taken on with Bensalem, and then Bodhi will send some of their casework to us to build these DNA profiles. And so this is a case that Bodhi started with. There was actually some pretty crafty work on their end to produce DNA that was usable. And we like working with Bodhi. They're an exceptional lab. They do a good job developing extracts. And so they had developed the extract in this case, and then they sent the case to us, and we built a profile. At that point, the profile actually was returned back to Bodhi. And as I understand, law enforcement actually did the genealogy. So here's another big team project, right? You have Bodhi preparing DNA, Othram building that profile using our very exclusive method, and then law enforcement using records to eventually produce an ID. It's a cool collaboration. To answer your question, it depends. Sometimes we stay engaged if the law enforcement asks us to. Sometimes there's evidence from the suspect test. Sometimes there's not. But I would say a lot of the times, just knowing who the person is triggers information that leads. In a lot of the cases we've done, just knowing who the person is has triggered enough information to then find out who is responsible. In the case you specifically mentioned, we've not been asked to do anything. So, we were, like I said, we were asked by Bodhi to help build this profile. We built the profile, and that was our role. That was our finite role in this project. And we're thrilled that we got the chance to work on it, because I will tell you, it was some tricky evidence. And I think, like I said, you just can't process all evidence everywhere.
Out of the ones that we've mentioned so far, the publicker girl, Christine Jessup, Grace Doe, mostly harmless, what would you say the one that has been the trickiest for you to deal with? I'm sure they're all tricky in their own way, but yeah. I'm just curious which one has been trickiest for you.
I would say the Christine Jessup case had pretty badly damaged DNA. So that one was pretty tricky. And we did that one earlier on. So it took a lot of effort to really produce a profile that we felt proud of. We don't want to just produce a profile. The whole point is to produce a profile that can ID someone. So producing a profile is easy. Producing a useful profile is very hard. And so we spent a lot of extra time trying to put together what would work, and obviously it worked out well. So we're thrilled. I would say our, at least in the area of quantity, our so far lowest announced case in terms of DNA quantity would have been Rodney Johnson. That was a Lake Stickney doe that was in Snohomish County with Detective Jim Sharp. We ID'd him from about 20 human cells. It's 180 picograms. And so I think that's actually the lowest quantity of DNA used in a published case to date by anybody. That's very little DNA. And so we were able to build that profile. But in the ones that we mentioned so far, I think Christine Jessup was pretty tricky. They're all tricky for different reasons, but many of them are pretty tractable, and our processes improve. One thing that we use as a criteria when we take on new cases is, have we tried something that was similar to this and had a positive outcome? And so you can imagine, because we do all the work in-house, we're touching everything with our own hands, and we're essentially learning, through blood, sweat, and tears, trying to get evidence to produce good profiles. And that education has allowed us to progressively increase the scope of work that we're comfortable working on. So we take broader evidence types now than we did even 6 months ago, because as we build up confidence, we feel, sure that we can then bring value to cases that otherwise we would have said, just wait. And we've done that before. We have a case right now. We have a really great case right now that's not announced yet, where we actually told law enforcement that we're going to reject the case. It was not the right case for the technology at the time. But within a year, we came back to them and said, you know what? I think this case, we never forget a case. We keep them all. So we came back a year later and we said, I think we feel confident. We've worked enough cases that are similar to where we think we could actually help in this particular case. Okay. And law enforcement, of course, is thrilled, right? Because these are cases that have gone cold. DNA testing is really the only way to move forward. They gave us the evidence, and now we're going to have a positive outcome to report. We didn't just get a good profile. We got what I think is a soon-to-be confirmed identities. So it's exciting. It's exciting to help others like NCMEC and other agencies that have had a failed case in the past and then recovered and build a profile. But it's also exciting to be able to go back to our own folks that we've told them, please wait, we'll come back later, and then be able to show them a success. And it just strengthens our confidence in the approach that we use, which is like, proceed carefully. There's hundreds of thousands of cases. There's no rush to run any one particular case today. Take the cases you can bring value to, come back to the other ones as technology improves. And it keeps improving. We're getting better and better at what we do.
Detectives have to be thrilled, though, when you come back to them a year later and say, yeah, that case we were talking about, we think we're ready. They've got to be, over the moon.
Yeah. Yes. The your case has been unrejected phone call is very exciting. Almost as exciting as here's a lead that I think will help you solve your case phone call. Those are also exciting because these folks, I think sometimes, at least some of them, they're like, look, this case is stuck. You want at it, go ahead. It's basically a lost cause. And then when you call them up and say, it's time to fire up your investigation, we've got a lead, they get really excited.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I think the leads were pretty sufficiently exhausted for Grace Doe. So you can imagine Paul's excitement when we called him up and said, you know what, I've got someone you need to call. And then, of course, when everything matches up, right, and you have a story of someone that was lost to a family, you have a genetic profile that ties the two together. That's the problem with these unidentified cases, right, is that these bodies, the Publicker girl, for example, she was reported missing and she vanished. But that incident and then the discovery of her body, they were at different time points. And sometimes, like in the Pecos Jane Doe case, there are different time points and different geographies. A girl goes missing in Kansas, turns up in the bottom of a pool in a Texas hotel. So that's why you need genetics sometimes. Sometimes when these unidentified persons and missing persons cases get disconnected by time or geography, like there's no way to connect them back. Sometimes you can. That's why the internet sleuths and the investigators in the world have been so successful. You can match things that look similar back together. But in cases that have been separated by time or geography, you need DNA testing to kind of break through that barrier, through that wall, and connect what otherwise would be never connected events. Rodney Johnson in Snohomish County is another example. Died at one point, body found at another point, reported missing at a third point. These points would not have been connected without DNA testing and the identification of a relative. So anyways, it's super exciting work, as I'm sure you can gather from my enthusiasm. We love doing it. And it's always exciting to share either that we can take on a case that previously was not something we felt comfortable doing, or that we end up helping them. And then we get the excited phone call too when the investigator calls us, because look, we produce leads and at that point our work is done, and we rely and depend on the investigators to do some pretty exhaustive work sometimes to sort out what happened. And then they call us back and they say, hey, I got some good news. Here's the answer. And so we're always excited to hear the answer.
David, this is so exciting. How can people help? We've been talking about contributing funds and DNA to crowdfund particular campaigns. Are there other things that people can do to help Othram and DNA Solves move forward?
There's basically 3 ways that you can help at DNA Solves. The first way you can help, and if you go visit DNAsolves.com, is we have campaigns that need to be funded. So you can come in there, donate a few bucks, and help take a case from unfunded to funded, so that we can bring the next step, which is from funded to solve. So that's an easy way to help. Another way to help is if you feel comfortable and you want to share your profile, DNA Solves has a database similar to the other genealogical databases used by law enforcement. Our database is only for law enforcement and it's only used for law enforcement investigations. So, you should upload your data wherever you can. And you can do that at DNA Solves very easily. It doesn't cost anything. And very often you won't even realize, but you may be a distant relative to someone that's unidentified, or, someone that may have died and just never had any family, or a distant relative to that person. That actually happened in the Mostly Harmless case. There were some folks that that were from the area that contributed their data, and it got us closer and closer to that hiker's identity. And the third way that you can help is really just to share the stories. I mean, we've had some cases, I think I've told you in previous interviews, we had a case once that solved without us even doing anything. We just got the word out, and 48 hours later, before we got any evidence, Othram did nothing, but just announcing the case, someone recognized the details and said, hey, I know who that guy is. That was perhaps our fastest solve that we didn't solve. And,
that's a phenomenal outcome, though, just the same.
It is. That's right. Like, the goal is very important. Like, the goal here is to reconnect people that have died back to their families, or to sort out the details of a crime and figure out who was responsible, who wasn't responsible. So that's a singular mission. And I think it's important to think that way, because there are a lot of tools in the toolkit. You have DNA testing, you've got forensic facial reconstructions, you've got genealogy, you've got like the kinship testing that you can do to compare relatives, a lot of different tools available to you. And it doesn't matter which combination of tools you use. I mean, in the Mostly Harmless case, we actually used Facebook targeted ads to target the area which we identified that he was from through biogeographical analysis. 9 days after we started running Facebook ads, someone was like, I know who that guy is. So you just don't know what combination of tools will be necessary. And so I think that's why I say it's like, whether you want to commit some dollars to a campaign, which is always needed, whether you want to volunteer your own data, or even spread the word, because you just don't know. You don't know when you might reach by accident or even through a targeted effort the right folks that might know something about a crime. So those are the three ways that you can help. And anyone that wants to get involved should visit DNAsolves.com. There's a little button where you can click, a menu item where you can click all of our cases. You can filter the cases by cases that are not funded yet, ones that are funded but are waiting to be solved, and ones that have already been solved by law enforcement and we've had permission to announce the outcome. So you can kind of look at the cases that way, stratify them. We've got a new feature coming into DNA Solves pretty soon. You might have noticed if you look at DNA Solves every day like I do, we now have a little geographic.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas.
I hope I'm not the only one that looks at it.
Our logo art is by Pamela.
We have these geographic pins now that assign a location to the cases,
in partnership
and
with
we're rolling out a new feature
Media.
pretty soon that will allow you to find cases
Facebook,
near you.
Twitter,
So
or
you can search by
You can
geography.
also follow our
You live
page
in
on the
Pennsylvania, and
Colonial
you're like,
Parkway
where's the
Murders
case
on
closest to me
Facebook.
here?
And
So we have a
finally,
case
you
that we
can follow
solved
Bill
right here in the
Thomas on
Woodlands,
Twitter
Texas.
at Bill Thomas
So that'll be my
56.
first case I see, I'm
Thank
sure,
you
when
for
we launch the
listening
feature.
to Mind
Can't get any
Over
closer than
Murder.
like a mile from Othram's office.
That's
It was a
amazing.
body that was found
Wow.
and never identified. And we helped the local agency here identify that person. So I think that we're always grateful for people that spread the word, help fund the cases, and then volunteer data that could be just, you never know, could be instrumental in providing that stepping stone to an identity.
David, thank you so much, and we'll look forward to another conversation with you.
Okay, well, I appreciate you having me.